Grief is such an overpowering emotion, especially after losing someone so close to you. It can take months, years, even decades to get back to normal, if that's even possible after experiencing a significant loss. This podcast was created to help you move through and release the emotions, allowing you to heal the hurt and begin living again. Listen in as I chat with medical professionals, grief workers, and people who have first-hand experience in losing a loved one, what their experience has been, and what they did to help heal themselves and those around them. Life isn't always sunshine and rainbows, but I believe there is always a silver lining if you're willing to look. Welcome to the Release Podcast. Welcome to another episode of Release Grief Podcast. Today I'm here with Nicky Yazbeck. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
I practiced ahead of time, so I'm happy about that. And she is coming in to talk about hospice and both sides of that coin, being in hospice and providing hospice. Well, not her in hospice, but her family members. This is coming out all wrong, but you go ahead and take it and explain what the heck I'm trying to say.
Oh, you're doing great. I have a master's in social work, and strangely, my first job out of graduate school was with hospice as a hospice social worker. So I was super young. I had this little baby face, and I went into hospice. And it was one of my favorite jobs. And at that time, I was just eating everything up, like every book that I could read about death and dying. I was reading. And so I've had that experience of being a hospice social worker, visiting with families, supporting families. And then also 4 years ago, my grandmother died, passed away on hospice. And then my father, sorry, 7 years ago, my grandmother, 4 years ago, my father on hospice. And so I was in the position of receiving services and being a family member and being on that receiving side of hospice. And I think hospice is really beautiful. I do think it's changed since I graduated from graduate school. And now I think the services have changed vastly, but I do think it's a beautiful service that's offered out in the world.
Yeah, I had an uncle that was on hospice, and so I don't really know. And my father-in-law was on hospice for a few months, whatever, because hospice isn't called until what, just before the end, like a few months before the end.
Yeah,
Uh,
technically it's
um,
6 months. The 6 months or less to live is when they're called in.
okay, and so based on your experience on being on both sides, what was the major differences, like um, giving the hospice versus receiving the hospice, like for your family members?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like giving hospice was actually in some ways more intense. It was going into these homes. What I found that was really interesting was a lot of the families, I would be one of the first people that would go in. The nurse would go in, the aides would go in, we'd all go in and we'd have our session with the families. And as a social worker, I was supposed to get the biopsychosocial, get their background, see if they have support systems in place. And what I found, which I thought was really interesting, was that a lot of the family members didn't understand what hospice was, and part of me thinks that was a little bit of denial. And then part of me thinks that maybe sometimes the doctors speak in the jargon where the families don't completely understand it or they're uncomfortable. But it happens so often that I felt like a lot of times I was breaking the news that they had a diagnosis that was terminal and that they were given 6 months or less to live. And so part of it was supporting the families. And then part of it was the practical piece, which was, do you have a living will? Do you have a power of attorney? Do you have support systems in place? Have you made funeral arrangements? And I found that these practical things were really key, because the last thing you want to do when somebody dies is figure out the funeral arrangements. And although doing that ahead of time seems like um almost like you're,
Premeditated.
yeah, that's what people think. It takes the pressure out of the situation when it does come, and you can think straight. So at the last minute, if you're going and you're making funeral arrangements, you can't think straight. You're getting pressure. The funeral home, their job is to sell things. And so they're going to pressure you to get the nicest and the best and the most glamorous things, but that might not be what you want. And also that might not be what the person who's passing away wants. And so that's a chance to have that conversation about, what is it that you want? What kind of care do you want? What do you want that to look like? Who do you want to be here? And those types of things. When I was on the receiving end, Yeah, I can't even explain what that was like. It was just completely different. Like that was a just completely different box for me. It was intense, but I think because of all the social work background I had, I was in my head and I was being very practical, and I feel like I had a clear understanding of what was happening where and I don't think that they did a good job explaining it,
Oh,
explaining everything that would happen. And I remember when I was just out of school a million years ago, I was like 20, 30, like, oh my gosh, it was so long ago, 30 years ago. Um, when I was out of school, we did such a good job explaining, like, this is what you're going to expect, and this is what you're going to see with the breathing, and this is what you're going to see with the skin. And I feel like when we were in this hospice situation and we used two different companies, we weren't, our hands weren't held as tightly as when
mm,
we were providing services many years ago. And I'm not sure if it was the two providers that we had, or it was that the systems changed, but I'm hearing that it is not like it used to be.
really? That's, I would think that being a hospice, receiving the hospice, I would want my hand held a little bit more. I'd want to know what to expect, even if it's hard. But then again, after losing our daughter and losing our granddaughter, like I'm on a mission to like help people plan their own funeral, like decades before they ever have to go through that,
Yes.
or their family has to go through that because in reality, once they're gone, they don't really care, at that point.
Yes.
But it makes it easier on the family members to be able to honor the wishes of the person that's passing, to be able to plan that funeral and to be able to plan that funeral with a calm head, because you're right. Those funeral homes, like their goal is to sell. And when you're in a state of pain like that, you're willing to buy anything because you know, this is
Mhm.
what they would want. I want the best for my family or my family
Mhm.
member. I want this. Yes, absolutely. Tack that on. Money is not an issue until it comes time to pay the bill, and then money becomes an issue. And
Exactly.
then fighting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that idea of doing all ahead of time. Like my husband and I have our living will and our power of attorney. We've talked about what we want. And I feel as if somebody, if they have a living will, it makes it so much easier for that medical power of attorney. You just follow the living will. Those burdens of the decisions aren't going to fall on you. You can just follow the wishes of whoever's written them down versus having to make all those hard
Right.
decisions on your own, which is so stressful and creates a lot of breaks in families. And that was another thing I saw a lot, unfortunately, and we hear about it, but I've seen it. I've seen it in my family dynamics. I've seen it in other families, and I saw it in hospice that um, these types of things bring families closer together or they break them. And people do. They fight about money. They fight about who's going to get the chair, who's going to get the car, like really ridiculous things that are so unimportant, but it happens. It really happens.
Yeah, it would yes, because when you're planning a funeral, it's usually like within hours to days after they've passed. So
Yeah.
you're like fresh and raw and like the emotions are super high and it depends on if you have a battling family or not, as to
Hmm.
what, or if they had like a lot. And, I can't imagine someone having like being very rich and having lots of properties and having multiple children and then not having something in place and then battling over that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, another thing that I thought was super interesting in the field of social work was when I was in hospice, there are some people that would wait for their whole family to arrive before they would pass and let go. And then
Mm,
there were other people that the family was there 24 hours a day, never left the room. And then the one day everyone encouraged them to go and take a shower and to go home for an hour or two. That's when they passed away. And I could see that pattern, and that some people wanted to do that in their own privacy and other people wanted to do it with a gathering of people. And I think that there's some control that we have over that because I saw it so many times as well.
that's very interesting because yeah, like that would make sense, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even my mom's best friend passed away, and I was born in South Africa. And my mom flew back to South Africa to be with her friend. And minutes after my mom arrived, got off the plane and was there, then her friend let go. And so, and that's the kind of situation I saw was one family member. We would think that they're not going to make it through the night. But a family member would be coming 2, 3 days later and they just kept pulling through and pulling through. And then that family member would arrive and then there was closure.
That, death fascinates me so much. Like, my family thinks I have this abnormal obsession with it. But I think that, I think because I believe in a lot of spirituality
Hmm.
and we're here spiritually. And this is obviously just a vessel that well, maybe not obviously, but this is a vessel that we are occupying at this moment in time. Um, have you had any like experiences with like oh gosh, I'm gonna forget the damn name of them now. Near death experiences from people being in social work and stuff like that?
Yeah, I've had some really weird experiences. Um, I had, yes, I've had people have experiences where they have, a lot of people say they've gone to see the light, where
Mhm.
they come back into that experience, or they have a conversation with someone that's across the country and knows something that they're not supposed to know. And then they come back and they have this information, like really strange experiences like that. But the one that sticks with me the most um intense experience I had. I'm super logical and practical and like everything like scientific, right? You need to prove it to me. But I had an experience. I had this one man that I had grown really close to, and he didn't really have a lot of family. And I went to visit him, and he was in hospice. So sometimes near the end, you go into respite care, and that's in the hospital, but it's in another wing and it's still hospice. And so it looks like a hospital, but it's way nicer and more zen and calmer. Um, and so he was there. And I went to do a visit with him, and I walked in the door, and he was gone. He was dead. And I stood there for a minute, and I felt some kind of presence, and I was just looking at him, and he had this fly on him, and I kept trying to shoo the fly away because I was like, this fly is not supposed to be here.
Right.
But I had this really strong feeling that my presence wasn't welcome in that space. It was really weird, and I can't explain it. I went out to the nurses station and I said, this patient's passed away. And they said, oh, they knew. They knew they were waiting. And then I went back in like a half an hour later, and literally it was just a shell of a body. Like there was when I went in the first time, there was his presence was there, and it felt like he was encompassing that room, and it felt like I wasn't supposed to be in that space and I was an intruder. And then when I went back and I looked at him, there was just clearly this like shell, this emptiness. There was nothing left. It was almost as if his spirit had been pulled out, and that was just the shell that was left over, and that situation has stuck with me forever.
Yeah, yeah, I would think it would stick with me for a while too.
Yeah.
I had talked about like even going in as far as working for the um like the mortuaries or going in and working for the funeral homes and stuff like that, just to understand like the process of death. Not even the process of death, but like what happens after they're gone, like the family dynamics and helping people through that process. Haven't done it,
Hmm.
but I've thought about it multiple times. Um, in your experience with all of this, with being on both sides of, of the hospice care, what are some tips like that you've noticed? Like I know you talked about earlier about like planning, having the power of attorney, having these other
Hmm.
plans in effect. But like what are some other things that people can plan for when their loved one is in hospice?
Yeah, I think those are big ones: the living will, the power of attorney, the will, any paperwork, like knowing where somebody's documents are, where their passwords are. Um, just so that process is streamlined. But I also think it's really good to ask the nurse or ask the doctor really point blank questions about what to expect. Because near the end of life, there's some things that happen with the breath. There's some things that happen with the skin and the color of the skin that can kind of let you know when it's getting closer. Having said that, the timelines are always they're not as predictable. So my grandmother stopped eating. She didn't want to live anymore, and she actually stopped eating. It was 100% her own choice. She was clear. She was lucid. She was 97. She had a very
Wow.
vibrant life, and she just didn't want what was happening to her body anymore. She weighed about 110 pounds soaking wet, and they said there was no way that she would last longer than a week, and she went for a month. So I think sometimes we can defy science, um, and which is really interesting. And so, you can predict certain things, but then you can't. And I think the hardest part is really the part I struggled with as being a recipient of getting that hospice care is knowing that somebody's going to die. Um, and wanting them to be there and wanting them to be out of pain and wanting it to end too. And so there's this really weird emotional thing that happens where I just don't, it's like you're wanting it to finish, but you don't want it to finish.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's got to be quite the emotional toll on you going into these homes where you know these families are grieving extensively, and missing that. Like, how do you yourself, I don't want to say prepare for it, but in words, prepare for it, but then counter the grief? You know, what methods do you use on the back end, like meditations or whatever it is that you use?
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things that I received from hospice was there's two different avenues. One was to share your appreciations, regrets, and resentments with the person while they're still alive. And
Yeah.
so, really sharing like what you love and appreciate about them, anything that you regret that you did, or any kind of conflict in the relationship that you want to clear up. Um, and so I feel like that if you do that ahead of time, that will help the healing process move so much faster. Another one I heard was, I love you. I'm sorry. Please forgive me and goodbye. And a lot of times that goodbye is really hard, but a lot of times the person that is dying needs permission to let go from their family. And so a lot of times you'll see the family clinging and clinging and clinging. And then the person who is in the process of dying, they kind of hold on for that family member. And then when they're able to receive permission to let go and that it's okay and the family member is going to be okay, same thing. They tend to let go. And so I think that the more that you can clear up the muddiness while somebody's around, the faster the healing process will be afterwards. And then another thing that I think is really important and interesting is that a lot of times if somebody's on hospice, they look like they're completely out of it, but the hearing is one of the last things to go. And so you can still talk to them even though they might not seem coherent, and there's a good likelihood that they can hear and take in what you're saying. And so just sitting there and being present, and if you don't know what to say, you don't have to say anything. I think your presence speaks volumes, just holding their hand. And then those things, saying you love them, saying it's okay for them to let go, and that you're going to be okay, because you will be okay. And it's not going to not be painful. It's going to hurt like crazy,
Yeah.
but it's gonna get easier and you will be okay. And there are people, especially if you have your support system to lean on. And I think it's really important to lean on the support systems.
What kind of support systems do you like? Say you're walking into a hospice situation and they don't have a support systems. What would you suggest them to do? Like, how would they go about getting a support system if they don't have one in place already?
The person that's dying.
The person that's dying or the person that's there with them, like the family members.
Yeah, I mean, usually somebody has at least one person, and I think it's just being really honest about your feelings and not bottling them up and expressing them. I mean, I've seen people when the person's died grabbing onto the body and wailing and screaming and not letting go, and that might be their process. I think if anytime you can get something out of your body, it's good versus bottling it up. And so maybe it's talking to a therapist if you don't feel comfortable talking to your friends about it. And also knowing that that process ebbs and flows. So there's not a time limit on it for grief. There's no time limit. There's no, it's been a year and now you should be good. There's going to be these waves, and there's going to be these moments where there's holidays and birthdays and graduations or whatever these memories are that come up that are going to bring that wave up again that's really hard to process, and then it just gets easier. It does get easier over time, but there's definitely not an end. There's not a hard stop point to grief.
No, no, there's not. We lost our daughter 8 years ago this year, and there's still moments like all the time. The wind's blowing the wrong way, or the sky's
Mm-hmm.
the absolute worst shade of blue. But the
Mm-hmm.
grass is like a fraction of a centimeter too tall or too short or whatever, and it hits you. It
I think
hits.
it's harder when you lose kids. I do think that's way, way harder when things don't happen in a natural order. I think it's
Mm.
way harder to process and way harder to wrap your head around and way
Have
more
you
like,
done, Go ahead.
yeah, no, go ahead.
Have you done hospice for children and stuff as well? Or was it mainly adults or elderly, or what was
Hmm.
your like?
It was mostly elderly and adults. My husband is works in the pediatric intensive care unit. And so he sees a lot, and it seems like even with chronic illness with children, it seems that they tend to do better than their families.
Really?
Yeah, they tend to be more accepting. They tend to do better. And I think honesty is the most important thing. And with our own children too, like if something happens, um, not sheltering our kids from that. So when this was happening with my dad and my grandmother, I would bring my kid to be around them and to see what was happening until the very end when it would have just been too hard for him to notice. And we had conversations about it. And so before the age of 7, he had lost um my grandmother, we called her big grandma, and then my father, his grandfather, and then my parents lost 2 cats and we lost a cat. So we had like all this death, but now he's 10 and a half. He has this really clear understanding of the life cycle. For us, luckily things happen in order, right? We didn't lose a kid that was somebody that was
Right.
um very elderly and they had lived a really, really good life. And so it makes sense for him. And so I think it's important not to shelter our kids from the reality.
I would agree with that. I know that growing up, I have this abnormal thing where I cannot walk into and see the body in the coffin. I can't do it. And for me, it's because I don't want that to be the last vision that I have of them. I just want to remember them as vibrant, beautiful people.
Yeah.
So, but with children and stuff, I've noticed that, like even myself, until my daughter passed, I had this very weird, I don't know, association with death. Like it's not me, it's not mine, we're not here, that's later down the road. I'm going to be about 100 when I die, but we're not guaranteed any of that stuff. So it's just this weird thinking about something that's going to happen to every person, and we're just not talking about it hardly at all. And so I just
Yeah.
interesting.
Well, and some people, where, my husband and I are pretty young, we have a young kid, we already have that living will, power of attorney, we have our will, we have all that sorted out. A lot of people will think that that's morbid, but I think that
Yeah.
that's like smart planning, because you never know. A car accident could happen, something could happen, and we hope for that not to, but it can. And
Mhm.
so it is always good to prepare for that and to do it. I mean, there's not a lot of emotion behind it when I'm doing that planning now.
Right.
And so it's a lot easier for me to do that planning. Having said that, my mom, when my dad died, my mom bought her plot and took care of all her funeral arrangements at the same time. And it has a long-term healthcare policy and things like that. So that's taken the burden off of me as her daughter to know this is already set up. She has a plot, it's paid for. She has this long-term healthcare policy. I know her password to her safe. I know where all her documents are.
Mhm.
I'm hoping nothing happens for a long time, but it could. And so I don't have to scramble if something were to happen.
Yes, I agree with that. And we didn't have, when we lost our daughter, and it was, 8 years ago, but we were not prepared, obviously.
Mm-mm.
And it was a scramble for us to figure out what she wanted because we had no idea. Like she was 19, so it's not like you
My
sit there
gosh.
and discuss funeral plans with your child. Although my mindset has changed on it, I believe that every person should. I believe that we should talk about death and what we want for our funeral as a normal everyday dinner conversation instead of just pushing it off and think, oh, we'll do it later, we'll do it later, we'll do it later. Because the week before, I think it was either the week before or the month before she passed, well, that summer she had moved out of the house and about an hour and a half away. And her roommate, a good friend of hers, they were talking about what they wanted for their funeral plans if one
Oh,
of them
wow.
passed away. And so she told her best friend what she wanted, and that was and then her best friend, she shared that with us. And so that was how we planned her funeral, was based off of the conversation that they had had previously.
Wow.
Otherwise, we would have had no idea. We would have had
Yeah.
no clue because it's not like, you know.
Yeah. Well, and some people have very strong feelings about cremation
Yep.
or burial and are comfortable with one and not the other. And so it's just about talking about those things. And then at the end of the day too, I think it is important for the people that are left behind to have some kind of ceremony that works for them because it really is for
Yeah.
them and their loved one would want them to be taken care of in that way. I think it's really cool now that people are doing more of a celebration of life.
Yes.
And I love that. I just recently had a family member who was really young, in her early 40s die, and she left twins behind.
Well,
And everybody wore white to the funeral, and it was this big celebration of life. And we talked about all the things that were beautiful about her. And I love that. Not that it's not dark and not that it's not heavy, but if we look back to what she would have wanted everyone to celebrate and to have fun and to remember her and to be celebrating in her beautiful moments.
hmm I agree. I'm seeing a lot more celebration of life as opposed to, I can't even remember what they were before. Um, just a gathering, I think.
Hmm.
But yeah, the celebrations of life are much more common now. My mom does genealogy as well. And so she's invited to like all of these funerals and we have cemetery headstones. Like my kids have posed with cemetery headstones their entire lives because we'd go and we'd walk through cemeteries. And so people would ask her or ask me where she's at. I'm like, oh, she's just looking up dead people. It's fine. And they're like, what?
Yeah.
She's at the cemetery. She's at the cemetery or she's at the, place looking for names and whatnot. So for me, I mean, even having that weird, I don't know, thought about death, like I've been around it, with the headstones and the cemeteries and walking through all of the things, but still it didn't resonate that, death could be like right next door, right, in the next breath I take or, whatever, or my family members or anything like that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been talking a lot about this lately, is that I think it's really important to do things that push us out of our comfort zone too.
Yes.
Make us uncomfortable. And I think that's where we can grow too. So if it is a topic that makes people extremely uncomfortable, it's about dancing in that topic a little bit and working through that discomfort.
Yeah, I agree with that because there's a lot of things in life that make us uncomfortable and to face that, we just have to face it, talk about it, breathe life into it. And it's not necessarily, these are my thoughts and my opinions only. It's not necessarily for the person that's passing. It's for the people that are being left behind.
Yeah.
For the planning, of the funeral, of the planning of all the things, and whether the people that are left behind want to honor that person's, memory and plan everything according to that is up to them. But if they don't have a guideline, then they just get to do whatever they want to do anyway. So
Yeah. Do your best.
yeah, do your best and forget the rest. It's not what they say.
Well, and I think one of the things I learned recently was at that family member, that young family member that passed away, her husband said please don't ask us how we're doing, how we
Ah,
are. Because of course we're not doing okay. And that really struck me as important because I think a lot of times we call and we check in, we're like, how you doing? You doing okay? You doing okay? And then, we kind of, yeah, sure, we're doing okay. But of course we're not doing okay. And so maybe a better way of delivering that message I'm here if you need me, or if you need a shoulder to cry on, or if I can help with any of these arrangements. Because of course they're not okay.
no, and that's the first, like, I've noticed I hated it when people were asking me, "Hey, how are you? How is everything?" Well, how the fuck do you think everything is? It's shitty right now. Like, it's
Uh-huh.
shitty. Like, being honest, but instead of saying that, you're like,
Hmm.
"No, I'm fine.
Yeah.
Everything's good. No, I don't need anything." Because at that moment you can't think of anything that you would need, because the only thing that's on your mind is your loved one that you just lost. So I've seen a lot of people coming up with, like, buying grocery cards, gift cards,
Hmm.
or having groceries delivered, but I think that's a bit presumptuous because I don't know what people like to eat.
Hmm.
I would order meat for them and they're all vegetarians. That would be my thing, and then they'd be like, "Who the hell is this? Why is she ordering me all this food?" Um, but like buying grocery cards or something like that and sending it to them so that, when the time comes, because they're eventually going to need to eat again, um, and having that, or just, coffee cards or something like that, is a nice gesture. And a lot of times people just don't know what to say, and they just
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem
abandon
is
them.
people don't know what to say, so they just don't say anything and they
Yes,
just kind of disappear.
yes.
And so you could even just say, I don't know what to say, Faith. I'm
Right.
so sorry. I don't know what to say, but I'm here if you need me.
And that means the world. Like, I remember when our daughter passed, and of course you're in those murky days right afterward.
Hmm.
And our house is filled with family. It's filled with people, and there's all this noise. And you just want to be alone. To be honest, I just wanted to be alone. But the people don't know what to do, and so they come to the house to show support. And I love that too. And I remember my cousin, she had two little ones at the time, and she just brought over bagels with cream cheese, and she dropped them off at the door, and she said, "I can't stay. These are just for you to eat, and I love you." And she left. And
Yeah.
that was it. And that was enough. And I'm like, I still remember that vividly, because I'm like, that was such a beautiful gesture on her part. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to do. Um, None of the things. She just dropped off some food and left. Nothing.
Yeah.
And that was,
Yeah.
so there wasn't like an emotional, like, um I don't want to say, it's going to sound really horrible, but there wasn't like an emotional barrage that was forced upon you.
Yeah.
It's just literally bump, bump, bump. I love you.
Well,
Bye.
and that could be just a card in the mail too, where I'm thinking of you kind of card. Mm.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But this was like right after, before we'd ever planned anything, like the next
Yeah.
day, I think it was. Um, and then when we lost our granddaughter,
Wow.
there was a nurse that had saw the wreck, and
Hmm.
she stops by our house every year on the anniversary with a card to
Oh,
the parents and stuff for my son and his ex-wife now. And just sees how they're doing, how the kids are doing, all the things. And so it's those little things, I think, that mean the most.
yeah. Yes. I have a friend that had a miscarriage and I wrote it on my calendar and every year I just send her a message. I'm like, I'm thinking about you on this day. I know this day can be hard for you. And it's just that, right? It's
Yeah.
just like this was important to you and I haven't forgotten.
Yeah, because I think that as we move through life, like, society expects us to just get back to normal, whatever that is for society's
Hmm.
sake. And
Yeah.
getting back to normal is, obviously you're not, when you lose someone, it's you have a new version of your world, and people forget, or they're like, don't remember, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And people like that ghosted you, or you felt ghosted you through the whole ceremony and services, now a couple years later, like, "Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, I think that's common
Sorry."
because people are so uncomfortable and they don't know what to do or say. And so they just abandon.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
don't think
which
that
is
they mean
hurtful.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't absolutely think that they mean to, but it
Mhm.
happens. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
But
in the same vein too, when somebody is on hospice and you have time and you know that they're dying, and then there's like my grandmother, she went on for a month, and near the end, I will say that there's always somebody, the nurse said this to us, and this helped because it was pertinent with my grandmother and my dad. Um, there's going to be somebody that's always going to give the last dose of morphine.
mm,
And so I was that person. You give a dose of morphine, then she passed away. And so you need to know that it's not your fault that you're the
yeah.
last person. There's always one last person. But for those days leading up, it was, it's uncomfortable. She's kind of half in, half out. But we're not wanting to leave her alone. And so that's another thing is you can just go and sit with a person. You don't have to talk. I brought a book in. I brought my laptop in and did some work. It's just your physical body in that space. They'll feel it and they'll know you're there. Or you can play music. I did that too. I would just play music, or you could read them a book, even if you think that they can't hear it. And so that's a good way to provide support to also in respite, right? If somebody is a caregiver and they're doing this and it's just exhausting, that's how you can give your friend a break. Let me sit with whoever it is, and you can read. You can sit there and read your book. You can tell them stories, you can watch a movie, you can play music. And so those are some ideas about how to move through that discomfort. You don't necessarily have to engage the whole time. That's going to exhaust everybody.
True. Yes, it absolutely will. I have had a blast chatting with you about this.
Yeah.
It just fascinates me with, both sides of the coin and seeing, from, the clinical side versus the receiving side, um, of hospice, of death, of dying, all the things. And what would you leave our listeners with a bit of advice on if they're in a hospice situation or a respite situation?
Mhm. It's just hard. It's just so hard. And I do think it's really just important to lean on your support systems, to know that it's going to pass, to know that it's going to be awful going through it, and that you have the strength to do it, and that the more people that you can lean on, and the more you do ahead of time, especially with that clearing, clearing the darkness out of any relationship, just getting all that out of the way, saying what you need to say, all the unsaid things that you never said, just saying them, that's going to help you so much later with processing the grief. It's so important.
Oh, I love that. It's pertinent, very pertinent. Otherwise, you're left with all the regrets that you didn't get to say or the closure that you didn't get to have.
Yeah.
I love that. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for being
Yeah.
on the Release Grief podcast.
Yeah. Thank you.
Uh,
Thanks for having me.
yeah, absolutely. And if this episode resonated with you, please share it out. Please send it to the people in your sphere and like, subscribe, and all the things. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this special episode of Release. All the links plus a few extras are posted in the show notes below. And if you think someone you know could benefit by listening to this episode, please share it with them. And as always, keep going, keep being, keep doing. You are amazing.